Welcome to the webinar Offshore Wind in Asia Market Update. I'm Luke Brett from Reuters Events, working on renewable projects. This is one of several pieces of work we're doing on offshore wind. There are over 500 of you signed up today, so thanks very much for the great response, and thank you in advance to our panelists for their time. Just a brief bit of housekeeping before we begin. This webinar will last an hour and is being recorded, so we will send you the full audio within a week or so. You have the facilities to ask questions through the question box. I want the session to be highly interactive. I will be moderating, so do keep those questions coming in. The format for the discussion is Imogen Brown from Bloomberg New Energy Finance will complete a presentation on trends in Asia, followed by Rasim Hariz from Offshore Wind Consultants, also providing market insight. Then we'll do a Q&A for the remaining time. So without further ado, we'll begin. Imogen, do introduce yourself and let's get started.
Thanks very much, Luke. Hello, everybody. My name is Imogen Brown, and I work as a wind energy analyst at Bloomberg NEF. And today I'm going to talk you through some of the research that we've done recently looking at offshore wind markets in Asia, and also talk a little bit about some of the work we've done looking at how the pandemic has affected global offshore installations. I hope you find the presentation interesting, and I look forward to taking any questions you may have at the end. So just to kick things off, these three charts are essentially showing you our offshore wind forecasts out to 2030. So this is an exercise that we do a couple of times a year, and we try and predict the size of the offshore wind market over this decade. Now, this time round, we wanted to try and encompass the impacts of the pandemic. So the way we're thinking about this internally is essentially trying to divide the pandemic into three separate scenarios. So we've got a single wave pandemic, which is essentially where we expect the pandemic to be largely confined to this year. A multiple wave pandemic, which is where we expect to see sort of second spikes of pandemic and perhaps no economic recovery really until 2021, and then an enduring pandemic, which is where we see a little bit more of a longer lasting effect and economic recovery not really resuming until the end of next year. So those are the three sort of pandemic scenarios that we were trying to sort of assess the offshore wind sector against. But really speaking, the broad message that kind of take away from this is that actually offshore wind is still a big growth story, and that's across all three scenarios. So in the single wave pandemic scenario, we expect installations to grow around sevenfold from where they are today, and hit 193 gigawatts by 2030. That's actually an increase in our forecast from when we did this last year, and that's kind of sentiments to the fact that a lot of markets are actually upping their ambition with regard to offshore, even in light of the current situation. In the multiple wave pandemic scenario, things are broadly in line, and then in an enduring pandemic scenario, we expect a sort of slight reduction in cumulative total. In the enduring pandemic scenario, there's a few sort of categories of projects that we think will be most at risk. That's the subsidy-free capacity and some of the floating wind capacity, which could pose a little bit more of a technology risk and be maybe hampered in that scenario. But broadly, we think really, installations are or will be kind of fairly unscathed by the pandemic. We think the sector's resilient, and certainly a little bit more so than the onshore sector, for a number of reasons. These three charts are just showing you the forecast, but just in annual installations. So again, against those three scenarios, what we're looking at is a little bit of a sort of bumpy year-on-year effect, and that sentiment to the fact that the way we do this forecasting is pretty bottom up. So we look at each market individually, we scrutinize project pipelines, we try and determine whether we think those projects have a route to market. If so, when do we expect them to come online, assuming a sort of typical development timeframe of projects. And so, a lot of these numbers are actually made up by, individual blocks of projects, hence the kind of lumpy effect. There are some trends though, and I think you can see, in the single wave scenario, what we expect to see at least is, pre-2025 installations hover kind of around the 10 gigawatt mark, just under. And then from 2025 onwards, what happens is we see a big jump. that's kind of reflective of the fact that we see a lot of new markets at that point start to install capacity. So new markets, a lot of them in Asia, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, India, all stepping up to start installations perhaps from that point. In the multiple wave pandemic, things are pretty much in line. And then in the enduring pandemic, what we see is that actually these new markets could be a little bit harder hit. Perhaps the arrival of those new markets is slightly delayed, pushing capacity back towards the latter half of the decade. And the result is the fact that you see less of this kind of step change at 2025. You see more of a kind of gradual increase ramp up towards 2030. So that's the score in terms of annual installations. These charts are showing you exactly the same thing, annual installations, but just broken out by region. So EMEA is in the turquoise, you've got APAC red, and then the Americas in the blue. So if you were to look at this chart, pre-2020, obviously it would all be Europe. It'd be a totally green story. And now what we're seeing is Asia starting to come in. Pre-2025, that's driven by China. And then post-2025, as I keep touching on, these new markets are coming in Asia to really ramp up capacity. The Americas come in from 2024, and they kind of average around 3 to 4 gigawatts annually from that point. What I think is interesting to note about this is that, obviously, as I touched on pre-2020, we were talking it's totally a European story, and the supply chain has been confined to Europe, I guess, for the majority so far. But as you see, we kind of head towards this regional split. I think what we're expecting to see is that kind of supply chain diversify to adapt and to kind of meet that demand in those various regions going forward. This chart here is showing you our 2030 market leaderboard. So, imagine you're in 2030, what would we expect each market to have installed by that point? Now, China rules the roost across all three scenarios, and that's trumping the UK to top spot by 2030. The US and Germany come in third and fourth, and then beyond that, we see a number of markets making the leaderboard over the next decade. And again, we're seeing a lot of these new markets coming in: Vietnam, India, South Korea, Japan, particularly Asian markets that have essentially nothing installed today, to reaching over a gigawatt by 2030 and contributing a significant amount to global installations. So I'm just going to dive a little bit deeper into some of those markets that I've touched on now. Japan, just to kick things off in Japan, so we expect Japan to be around a 7 gigawatt market by 2030. And you can see across the three scenarios, that doesn't really change. Cumulative installations stay the same, but the key thing that's different is the shape. So in the case of a single pandemic, we expect, commercial installations to start in the next couple of years. But in the other two scenarios, we start to see that kind of delayed arrival of the sector. And that's particularly prevalent in the enduring pandemic scenario, where a lot of capacity starts to stack towards the latter half of the decade. The key thing that I want to sort of touch on in Japan really is that we think Japan will be predominantly a bottom fixed market over the next decade. And the reason for that, there's a number of things. One is that our sort of project pipeline is showing that all projects, or the majority of projects currently, are bottom fixed technology. There are a few floating partnerships that have been announced, but those that are sort of farthest forward and most advanced are bottom fixed. And the second thing is that the government has announced zones for its upcoming offshore wind tenders, and those zones are in sites that are bottom fixed. So this map is showing you the zones that the government has announced. In purple, you see the ones that are announced last year that will be the first round tenders, and the turquoise are the second round that were announced a couple of weeks ago now. We expect these zones in total to contribute around 2 gigawatts of capacity, and that sort of follows the government's ambition to install around 1 gigawatt of capacity annually. But the story really, we think, for Japan will be a bottom fixed market over the next 10 years. One of the interesting things that's interesting to note in Japan is that actually, to be successful in Japan's tenders, you don't need to just bid low. So this chart is showing you that actually only 50% of points in Japan's tenders are allocated to bid price. You can also score points from feasibility and experience. And what that means is we're seeing a lot of partnerships develop in Japan. So this chart is showing you essentially for all outside of bid price, you can score 120 points. Now, where could you score those points? And we think that if you are an existing Japanese player partnered with a foreign developer, you have the most chance of success. You could score maximum points outside of bid price. You score points in feasibility, project schedule, and risk analysis because you are a foreign developer and you've had experience in developing projects, but you also score maximum points in the experience category. And that's because you're an existing Japanese player who has domestic experience developing projects. So who are those players? This slide just shows you essentially the breakout, the split of developers that own projects in Japan, offshore wind projects on the left-hand side and onshore wind projects on the right-hand side. And you get points for experience no matter whether it's an onshore or offshore sector that you've developed your project in. And you can see from that sort of breakdown of developers there that there's a number of those that are now pursuing projects in the offshore space going forward, namely J-Power, Mitsubishi, Toda, etc. So those are the kind of domestic players that have experience in developing projects, and we'll see partnerships crop up with those players if you want to be successful. Taiwan. So moving on to Taiwan. Now, Taiwan is an interesting market. We expect it to be around the 10 gigawatt mark by 2030. The story really in Taiwan is that pre-2025 capacity is pretty much contracted. Capacity has also secured a route to market either through government feed-in tariff or auction mechanism. So really what we're waiting for in Taiwan is the post-2025 capacity. So what we're waiting for here is the market's master plan that will come out, and we expect that to support around 1 gigawatt of installations annually. One of the interesting things in Taiwan is that there's a number of projects that are actually queuing up to seek a route to market. So this chart shows you that in total there are 6.3 gigawatts of projects that have completed an environmental assessment that are now waiting to bid into some form of auction. And you can see they're sort of split out between players, and there's a fairly sort of diversified mix of players in the market. You've got domestic players, you've got foreign developers, you've got big developers, Ørsted, you've got Macquarie, you've got people with experience, and a lot of these projects, as I mentioned, have already secured environmental assessments. In fact, all of those, that's the list that all have. And so we've got a 6.3 gigawatt queue, we're saying, of projects that are waiting for some kind of route to market, for Taiwan to announce an auction that these projects could bid into. Now, that auction is probably likely to be 2 to 3 gigawatts. So a lot of these projects are going to miss out and will have to wait for the next round, or are seeking an alternative route to market. And that brings me nicely onto this slide, which essentially shows you some news that we saw last week in Taiwan, which was that Ørsted signed a deal with TSMC for a corporate PPA. So TSMC were off-taking 920 megawatts of power from Ørsted's asset in Taiwan. And this was significant for a number of reasons. It was the biggest corporate PPA deal that we've seen globally. It dwarfs the second largest is an onshore project in Sweden of around 400 megawatts. So it's a huge corporate PPA, and it's significant for the sector for that reason. We haven't seen many corporate PPAs in offshore, but why it's interesting as well is that Ørsted had already won in one of Taiwan's state-led auctions for the capacity for this project. So this corporate PPA, this deal with TSMC, is essentially providing that project with an alternative route to market outside of Taiwan's auction system. And that kind of plays into the hands of potentially those other projects that we talked about just now, all those projects that are queuing up waiting for Taiwan to announce its auctions. Could this be an alternative route through a corporate PPA? China is forecast to be our biggest market by 2030. We expect it to reach around 40 gigawatts, and that's across the board, across those three scenarios. The cumulative total doesn't change. The key thing to note here really is the shape of installations. So, in a single wave pandemic and a multiple wave pandemic, we expect to see this kind of build rush in 2021, and that reflects the state's feed-in tariff deadline, which is in at the end of 2021. So developers are sort of rushing to build their projects by that point. In an enduring pandemic scenario, we kind of assume that that feed-in tariff will be extended, and thus you see a bit of a less of a sort of boom bust, and projects are able to sneak into 2022 and still qualify for the state tariff. We're now waiting for provinces to step up in China and offer some kind of subsidy to projects. But I love this chart, and it just shows you essentially the number of projects that are in the pipeline in China. So in the green, you've got those projects that we think will commission pre-2021 and that will qualify for the feed-in tariff. And then the capacity, the pipeline capacity of projects that are queuing that will potentially miss that 2021 deadline. And this is data correct as of January, so it might have changed slightly, but the sentiment is still there. We've got around 40 gigawatts in the pipeline. It's huge. We only have around 30 gigawatts of capacity installed in the sector today, so it's larger than the whole global offshore wind sector so far. The last market I just want to touch on is Vietnam. Now, Vietnam is a very exciting market. I think we expect it to reach around 5 gigawatts, and that's pretty much from nothing today. The exciting thing in Vietnam is the government is kind of making headway with regard to renewables. It's announced a target of around 20% renewables in the energy mix by 2030, and it sees offshore wind as a potential pillar towards that. There was a feed-in tariff in place in Vietnam, and projects were trying to qualify by the end of 2021, but they've announced that now is been proposed to be extended to 2023, and that obviously comes as good news for developers in Vietnam. Beyond 2023, we expect the government to step up and offer some kind of subsidy, perhaps through competitive auctions. And as a result, you can see, post 2025, we're forecasting a fairly steady annual installations across the board. So that sort of concludes the market-based stuff. I want to touch a little bit on some of the data that we've got on supply chain. So twice a year, when we do our market outlooks and our market forecasting, we also collect data on turbine market shares. So the next few slides, just running through some of those. This shows you the global picture. So what you can see here is on the right-hand side, obviously, the number of different turbine OEMs and all those projects that have secured contracts in some form for turbines. Now, what's really interesting about this chart is that you can see pretty much up to 2024, capacity is already contracted. So we're looking really 2025 and beyond for the opportunity. If turbine suppliers are looking to sign contracts, they're looking at projects coming online from 2025 onwards. And that's kind of, I guess we saw a lot of announcements around new big turbines, Siemens 14 megawatt, GE 12 megawatt. And when we think about the business cycle for offshore wind, it's a long business cycle. So we're not going to see those turbines really in waters, for a good few years yet. This just shows you the picture outside of China. So you can see that really it's a three-player battle. Siemens rules the roost, and then you've got MHI and GE following. Again, the opportunity is really coming in 2025 and beyond. We think here, I think the kind of what I want to draw your attention to is that, ex-China, we expect those three players to dominate. So, in Asia, we will expect that the Western OEMs take the majority of market share. We might see a few sort of manufacturing hubs crop up in Asia, but we think that it will be confined largely to those players. In China, the story is slightly different. So this is the same, but we're just talking, Chinese installations. you can see the market is a little bit more diversified. There's a few more manufacturers, but really going forward, I think the key thing to focus here on is that supply is starting to consolidate. The majority of capacity is signed by top 3 players, which is Shanghai Electric, Mingyang, and Goldwind. Just to note there, 2025 capacity is sort of grayed out because that's a placeholder for us. But the key message here really is again, you know, diversified mix currently, but going forward, we could see supply consolidate as we've seen in Europe. I'm just going to finish off by talking a little bit about our view on floating wind. So we expect floating wind to be around a 3.5 gigawatt market by 2030. Now, that's pretty big growth from where we are today, but it's still pretty small compared to the overall bottom fixed sector. On the left-hand side, you can see what that looks like in terms of annual installations. So over the next sort of few years, we expect a number of demonstration type projects to come online, and then we'll see a little bit of a lull. And then we think installations will ramp up again, and we'll see some sort of pre-commercial scale projects start to commission from 2028. Key markets driving that will be South Korea and France. So South Korea has a REC scheme in place, and that REC multiplier actually plays into the hands of floating wind. It gets larger the further you are from shore. So that's a good thing for floating wind. And we think South Korea will be a key pillar in driving the floating wind market for this decade. France is another market where floating wind could prosper. The government has set out specific auctions, technology-specific auctions, for floating wind, and has pledged to support the technology. So we think those two markets will be really the key drivers this decade. What's interesting to note, as I touched on before, is that we think Japan will be predominantly a bottom fixed market for the next 10 years, and therefore doesn't contribute a significant amount of capacity to that total. This chart here shows something that we all know. Floating wind is more expensive than bottom fixed. So you've got essentially what we're looking at here is CapEx multiples on $1 million per megawatt basis. For each project, each of the dots represents individual projects and the year that they closed finance. The pink ones are floating and the turquoise are bottom fixed. So you can see, you know, floating has been more expensive. But what I like about this chart is it shows you, you know, for those floating wind projects that have secured finance most recently, they're actually in line or broadly in line with some of the most expensive bottom fixed projects. So there has been a path to cost reduction for bottom fixed, and you know, there's a potential there for floating as well. These two charts just kind of highlight the opportunity for floating wind, and I love the one on the left because what you can see here is a kind of you know, in that top right-hand corner, that big purple box is showing you the floating wind opportunity. So the chart is looking at, on the y-axis, water depth versus distance from shore, and all the dots are individual projects. So we think the key floating wind opportunity is at that point where, you know, you can't use bottom fixed foundations anymore. It's too deep, but also, you know, far from shore where you can no longer see the turbines, but also where the resource is often significantly better. And on the right-hand chart, that kind of emulates that. So we're looking here at capacity factors for UK offshore wind projects. All the grey lines are showing you individual projects, and the green as the fleet average. You can clearly see that Hywind Scotland, which is the first multi-turbine floating wind project, in the red has significantly higher generation than the rest of the fleet. And that kind of emulates the fact that, you know, with these floating turbines, you can put them out in areas where you can capture some of the best resource. So just to finish up, this is my final slide, and just talking here a little bit about some of the sort of cost reductions for floating and how we see the path to getting towards some kind of cost competitive nature with bottom fixed. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at a CapEx breakdown of one of the most recent demonstration projects in floating wind. And the blocks are showing you essentially which components need to reduce in cost to become cost competitive with a bottom fixed commercial scale project. And the key areas for cost reduction really are the wind turbine itself and then the foundation. We all know the foundation needs to reduce in cost, and there's a number of ways that will happen. You know, one is obviously a sort of engineering, I guess, optimization when the current projects that have been installed are demonstration type projects, and as we head towards commercial scale projects, we expect that there will be less of a sort of cost premium on these projects, and that will come as we start to scale up the industry. But I think one of the things that's key to note, and is shown in the right hand chart, is the kind of, as we scale up the capacity of the turbines that we put on top of these foundations, that plays into the hands of floating wind. So if you look at the right-hand chart is showing you on a tons per megawatt basis how heavy the floaters are, essentially, if you're using a concrete or a steel floater. And the lines are showing you that of a sort of commercial scale project for floating. And what you can see really is that, you know, as you scale up the capacity of the turbine that you put on top of it, you don't need to significantly increase the weight or the material of the floater. And that means you don't need to significantly increase the cost. So if you're putting a 6 megawatt turbine on top of your floater versus a 12 megawatt turbine, you don't have to double the amount of material that you put into the floater. And therefore, you know, the cost reduction plays into the hands as you put bigger turbines on top for floating wind. So that's really the story with regard to floating wind. As I say, you know, we expect this half of the decade installations to be confined to a few megawatts, really, as a few gigawatts, sorry, really. But you know, these key cost reductions we think will come beyond that as the sector starts to scale up, and we can see the capacity in the market to drive this to happen. So I'm going to finish there. I hope everybody found that interesting, and I look forward to taking the questions that you have at the end.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you are enjoying this session so far. Thanks, Luke, and thanks, Imogen, for the introduction and the brilliant outlook on the APAC region. So I will probably go through a very quick introduction of myself. So Rasim Harris, I'm Principal Consultant and Global Head of Business Development within Offshore Wind Consultants. Obviously, APAC is clearly part of our interests and footprint in terms of looking at that global regional market. So I'll just take you through a couple of slides introducing OWC and what we do, going through the established and emerging markets across the region, namely Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam, and also the other markets like China and India, and then finish off with some outlooks on the way forward in terms of offshore wind deployment in the region. So very quickly, Offshore Wind Consultants is part of the large AqualisBraemar group. We've got 160 years heritage in terms of coming from the Salvage Association and now becoming a global consultancy covering a lot of activities across the marine space, and we are pretty much the renewables arm of this group, managing projects, delivering engineering, consultancy and advisory works, and we are pretty much known as just OWC. So as you can see here, our global footprint includes a lot of local expertise, and in terms of APAC and in terms of offshore wind specifically, we are pretty much present across Taiwan with our big regional hub out there, and we have already established our offices to cover the Japanese market from Tokyo and the South Korean market out from Seoul, and we are looking forward to working a bit more on the regional markets and the new markets that are emerging. I will touch upon later on in the presentation. So if we look at what we do, is pretty much technical advisory works, engineering consultants, and project management, and we've got the support of many of our colleagues in terms of their maritime capacities, master mariners, naval architects, project managers, and engineers. And clearly, we are one of the very few international consultancies 100% focused on offshore wind. And obviously we engage with a variety of stakeholders involved in the offshore wind industry. It goes from offshore wind developers, going through all the development phase, construction phase, and the operation phase. We have also some engagement with the supply chain when it comes to transaction, technical due diligence, and taking the projects forward in terms of constructability, and also with the investors and the financial side of the players involved in the offshore wind, with business intelligence reports tailored to different markets across the globe. And clearly APAC is one of the most important drivers right now outside of Europe. So if we look at the established and emerging markets, I think the very first example is Taiwan. We've seen the market really developing across the last decade, from the demonstration incentive program with very outstanding 2 demonstrator wind turbines, and then the first demonstrator projects, including the Formosa one. I think that was something the Taiwanese government put in place, in the sense that it was really to demonstrate the potential of Taiwan and then take it forward to be one of the most established markets, not only in APAC but also in the world. And the fact that it's attracting a lot of players, international ones, from the Ørsteds to the WPDs and the Innogs and the Macquaries, this is really a very strong signal of the attractiveness of this market. And the success of this planning actually went through the zone application program, with 36 zone of high potential announced. A lot of those developers started building their consent application that is now around 10.5 gigawatt of consented projects. Some of those projects, 5.5 gigawatt, have been awarded feed-in tariffs, and they are ready to go for construction and operation. The attractiveness of the Taiwanese market also is really remarkable, in the sense that it brought some of the international institutions in the infrastructure space. We've got the FIDs of WPD. Remember that they attracted more than 20 international banks, mainly from Japan, and this is also a very good signal of the healthy character of this market. Now we are moving towards the second stage, to the zonal development, with some announcement from the government just last month on 1 gigawatt capacity to be awarded from 25, following the 5.5 gigawatt already commissioned. I think it's really a good signal sent out to the market with regards to this exciting opportunity out there. We can see that with the Bureau of Energy of the Ministry of Energy in Taiwan, the outlook is really impressive. 15.7 gigawatt to be operational by 2035. The key drivers are obviously the maritime special planning. I think the Taiwanese authorities are really keen to get things a bit more organized, given the growing portfolio. They're also looking for a very good management of the stakeholders around, in terms of fishermen and shipping activities, and also attracting more and more international supply chain investment. I think we've seen MHI Vestas already establishing a hub out there. We've seen Siemens Gamesa doing similar setups to service all the projects they are about to deliver. And I think this was really important in terms of giving that confidence in the market. So now that a lot of the projects were being consented, will go through the next stage of application for some support mechanism. I think this is something to be watched very closely. We see that the projects with less than 50 meters water depth will go first for some obvious economic and cost reasons. The others will be rather in the floating side, and the plan is to get new auctions going on a yearly basis, awarding 1 gigawatt a year. Obviously, all the ramification of the announcement are still to be digested. It's still work in progress, but this is something we see as really encouraging in terms of ramping up the capabilities out there. The process that's been announced last month is kind of two-step approach with qualification and pricing. The qualification is rather based on the technical and financial capabilities of the candidates, along with their ability to engage with the local stakeholders to secure some decent level of acceptability. And then the pricing is really the main differentiator for the second phase. We can see that with the TCMC deal, I will touch upon later on. The subsidy-free bids are on the table. Not sure it's going to be the way forward for all the projects, but this is something being considered. And if there is really kind of very equal bids across the two phases, then draw will apply to separate the candidates and give the award to the candidates winning the draw. I think last week we've seen that Taiwan is being now considered as a game changer with this last corporate PPA signed with the largest semiconductor foundry in the world in Taipei for 920 megawatt project with Ørsted, and this news is just setting a new precedent in terms of how the upcoming projects or the projects that are queuing up for some support mechanism will find a route to market. Clearly, Ørsted being a game changer for a couple of years now in terms of bringing some innovation to their development in the offshore wind space. We can see that there is something to be further explored here by the developers out there, and if we take the example of the UK on Seagreen with the corporate PPA signed with Statkraft, I think we didn't expect at all seeing this kind of largest CPPA coming out from Taiwan. So this is clearly a very good signal of the attractiveness of the Taiwanese market. Moving on to the second most attractive market, I would say, outside of Taiwan is obviously Japan. I think Imogen touched on it in details, but what I would like to highlight here is the fact that we've seen and we've expected a lot of development in the offshore wind space in Japan over the last decade following the Fukushima events. We see a lot of potential out there. I think the Offshore Wind General Waters Act is really setting the scene now for a proper portfolio to be developed out there. The first auction has just been launched by the Minister of Economy and the Minister of Infrastructures for round one, and it's going to be a yearly auction system for the upcoming projects. I think what we could say about the Japanese market is that the bottom fixed projects will go first, clearly for the reasons I explained earlier. We see floating to be mainstream from 2025 going forward. The projects are still at a very early stage, and we see also the fact that the European-Japanese partnerships are more or less established now with big names. Again, Ørsted, we see Innogy, CIP, WPD, all those players already knocking the door of the Japanese market. So it's going to be very, very interesting to watch. Similarly, than the auction that's been announced in Taiwan, the process is rather about making sure the developers have got the capabilities to develop the projects, understanding the Japanese setup, and this is why the Japanese players are absolutely important for any project to be developed, and it's a win-win situation between the two kind of players, experienced from Europe and very well established EPC or utilities out from Japan. The process, as I said, is quite similar. So the winners will be awarded zones with exclusivity rights for over 30 years. This lease is really important to be really developed according to the technical development, and making sure that all the stakeholders around the area are well engaged with, talking here about fishermen communities and also the environmental associations that need to be part of this process. So very interesting market, and I think the 10 gigawatt by 2030 is something the Japanese government is really keen to achieve. If we move on to South Korea, 10 gigawatts as well, planned by 2030. I think the largest business potential is clearly on the floating side, especially on the south, east, and the southwest part of the country. We've seen some players like Equinor partnering up with big names in South Korea, and this is a really clear signal that projects on the floating side with capacities over 500 megawatt are feasible. Now, when it comes to finding the route to markets, to those markets, is still a little bit up in the air, as there are some clarification on the mechanism of support. We're talking here about certificates of RPS that really lack of clarity. You add on top of that the complex permitting and consent. We know that there will be some of the early projects that will go ahead by 2030, but clearly the majority of the portfolio will be implemented from 2033 going forward. And the reason is there are some clarification with the central government and the local governments to put in place a very clear mechanism of support of the offshore wind. But the fact that a lot of players are out there already, it sounds really a good signal of the confidence of those developers to step in the South Korean market. One thing to mention as well is the fact that the fishing community has got a very strong lobby with the central government, and therefore all the developers will have to deal with this in a very active dialogue to make sure the project is well accepted in order to fulfill its potential and go into construction and operation. Vietnam, I think Imogen touched on this promising market. I think the reason of its attractiveness resides in the fact that it's a very narrow country, but a very long country with a very high potential, especially on the south coast. The Vietnamese government is actively engaging with the World Bank in their offshore wind program, and they're really trying to drive that forward. I think we've seen solar projects going exactly through the same process and hurdles when it comes to getting the projects off the ground. Offshore wind gives this ability of building large-scale projects off the coast, and this is something the Vietnamese government is really keen to implement. So we'll have some competitive tenders coming out from 21 to 23, pending the energy master plan approval, which is already ongoing. But clearly, this doesn't prevent some of the international developers and the local developers to progress their projects. I'm thinking here about Enterprise Energy and Mainstream on their respective projects. And we can see also some of the international European players already setting up their businesses out there, which is also a good signal for the Vietnamese market. So this is really something to be watched very closely. If we move on to the other markets, obviously China is one of the most important markets, and it will be the most important markets by mid of this decade. We can see the potential. We can see a lot of developers going quickly to apply for the feed-in tariff by end of 21 to secure the financial investment decision for the projects. The largest offshore wind market in the world is going to have something around 30 gigawatts in terms of capacity. Obviously, we don't really touch on the Chinese market from an international perspective, given the fact that it's pretty much closed markets. Maybe some exceptions like EDF that bought a stake in the Chinese Energy Investment Corporation, 500 megawatt, but that was a kind of deal in a very broader setup, including some nuclear interests as well. So that was really the only exception. But clearly, if you look at the Chinese supply chain, supplying global equipments to the offshore wind, it's clearly something not to ignore. Equinor also have signed an MOU for some projects to be developed in China with a view to get some interest from the Chinese players in some of the assets in Europe. And last but not least, I think the Indian market is also important to outline here. The national targets for offshore wind are pretty much high, based on the Offshore Wind Act back in 2018. India being India in terms of scale, in terms of complexity, and in terms of taking the projects off the ground quickly. It's taking time, and a lot of players are really keen to better understand the government intentions in terms of implementing their offshore wind ambitions. I think the most obvious example was the Gujarat tender in 2019, where 30 players from the offshore wind, established players, were really waiting for further information on the way forward out there. I think India is just keen to take a very central and regional approaches that are taking a bit of time. So this is something really to watch, but clearly the potential of offshore wind in India is one of the biggest in the world, even though the wind speed are rather on the mid level rather than on the high side, especially on the southeast and the northwest of the region. So just in terms of outlooks, I think Asia along with Europe are clearly leading the offshore wind deployment at different paces, different regions, as we've seen. For examples, comparison between Taiwan and countries like Japan are demonstrating that. The regional competition across all those countries will definitely foster the offshore wind deployment. Supply chain will diversify, and we can see that the population density is growing up. So offshore wind has got a place out there, and it's a matter of getting the projects off the ground with decent support from the government. We see also some of the markets we didn't really touch on coming out with some initial inquiries and initial strategies being developed. I'm thinking about countries like Philippines, especially on the floating side, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. We see floating offshore wind as part of the global hubs. Clearly, Japan, South Korea, Sri Lanka will be the places where we'll see further deployment on that front. The good news about APAC is that they've got world-class shipyards, and it's one of the biggest offshore EPCs. So we see that in terms of offshore wind deployment, this is something that could be further developed to service the regional markets. The reliance on European experience is still needed by the mid of this decade, but clearly we can see that qualified labor from the region will be needed to sustain the ambitions we are talking about here. And last but not least, the clarity on the processes and the blended approaches with the European experience and the regional experience will be the way forward for further deployment. Happy to take any questions. Thanks a lot, Luke.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So now we'll move and transition through to our Q&A. So we've got some excellent questions coming in from the audience. One particularly is from Alex Blackburn. He asked, to what extent is the success or growth of Japan's domestic offshore wind market a result of Japanese companies, e.g. trading houses and utilities, investing in European projects over the last decade? Rasim, you touched upon that. Do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think the Japanese players have been very active in Europe over the last decade, and the reason is obviously from a financial perspective. Large capital-intensive projects like offshore wind attracts a lot of people, but in the same direction, some of those players are investing in order to ramp up their capabilities in Japan as well. If you take J-Power, they're investing in projects in the UK, on projects like Tritonal, and now they've got a very solid pipeline in Japan to service it. So I see them doing that just to ramp up their capabilities as well, and to service other projects outside of Japan as well, and competing against the Europeans in 2 or 3 years' time.
Absolutely. Imogen, do you have any comments to add on that?
Yeah, I think as Rasim said, we've seen a lot of that strategic type investment coming in from Japanese players in Europe, and as I touched on in my presentation, I think those partnerships will be key going forward. A lot of them have been built in Europe, and that will be key to the sector success going forward. So yes, absolutely, I think that has been a key part of it.
I want to ask also about the supply chain then. So in a lot of the emerging markets like Vietnam, how ready is the supply chain locally there for this sort of expansion? Rasim, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I think if we look at the supply chain across APAC and particularly servicing the offshore space, I think a lot of it is already doing a lot for the oil and gas sector. So in terms of technical capabilities, there is a clear yes on the ability to service the market. Now, when it comes to a growing portfolio, clearly we need a bit more than just the existing supply chain. And if you add on top of that the certification and the regulation around building big substructures, if we are talking about people doing that, I think we need a bit more clarity in terms of norms to be applied out there in order to get something sensible and something interesting in terms of getting them servicing those markets. The reason also is we can't service the APAC market from Europe anymore. It's going to be the case probably for a year or two, but then there is a need to establish a regional capable supply chain.
Yeah, and Imogen, comments to add?
I'd just say, just to add to that, in Vietnam, I think it's a very interesting market that a lot of these sort of intertidal type projects. So a lot of them actually using turbines that are not used elsewhere in the offshore space, perhaps more onshore type turbines. So I think specifically in Vietnam, that will be one of the things that we're looking at going forward, is to how that market can specifically scale up and start to use the sort of offshore turbines as projects go further.
Another interesting question actually would come from Colm, who asks, with the feed-in tariff ending in China, do you expect Chinese turbine suppliers to look outwards and compete with Siemens Gamesa, MHI Vestas, etc. outside of China? Imogen, you touched upon that in your slides. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, from my charts, I think made it a bit clear that probably not in the near term. We don't think they will. For developers to sort of trust the turbine manufacturers, they've got experience dealing with Western OEMs. I think those will take the lion's share of the market going forward. In the onshore wind space, we have seen a few sort of deals with turbine manufacturers, Chinese OEMs penetrating outside of China, but it's been slow progress, and I think that will be similar in the offshore wind sector.
And of course, Rasim, many comments as well from yourself on the role of Chinese OEMs looking outwards, particularly looking at how much growth Europe's going to project to see in the next coming decades.
Yeah, clearly, if we look at the wind turbines only, we've seen Siemens Gamesa dominating pretty much the offshore wind market so far. Now it's a little bit more balanced with MHI Vestas and GE being around. But if you look at the global portfolio, I don't think those three will service the whole market, and this is where the Chinese OEMs will step in. If we look at the transmission in the offshore wind space, it's also very much dominated by the European and American OEMs, and we see the Chinese stepping in very hardly, and we'll probably see them in Europe as well very shortly in terms of their capabilities and also their cost competitiveness, which is now one of the very main drivers in offshore wind in Europe. So clearly there is a room for them to step in.
Absolutely. Well,
add there, Luke, just on the sort of turbine sizes as well, which I think is interesting. Traditionally, sort of Chinese OEMs have kind of lagged behind Europe with regard to turbine size, but we're starting to see a lot of those Chinese players sort of up their game with regard to sort of double-digit type turbines. Mikyang, for example, announced a couple of weeks ago an 11 megawatt platform. So they're definitely sort of following the lead of the European OEMs.
Yeah, so I suppose we're unfortunately already coming up to the hour, but I'd just like to end just quickly. Imogen, do you have any kind of last thoughts, last projections? Obviously very optimistic, the market outlook, even despite COVID. Final thoughts for this morning or evening, wherever the audience are.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's definitely something to keep an eye on. The kind of APAC boom, I guess, is coming, and we see from our outlook, a lot of that capacity being driven by these new markets. Yeah, watch out for Asia and watch out for some markets.
Fantastic. And Rasim, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think APAC is clearly at the heart of the offshore wind development. Let's be clear on that. Outside Europe, it's going to be the place to be for a lot of investors. And we've just tapped into 3-4 markets, but clearly the potential is really huge there, and probably the most important globally going forward. So looking forward to further developments out there.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, thanks an awful lot, Rasim and Imogen, for your time and analysis this morning. Thank you everyone for attending. It's a shame we couldn't get through, absolutely all of the questions, but glad we got to get through a couple. Stay tuned for the rest of the work we're doing at Reuters Events on offshore wind. I do wish you a pleasant rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.